Now, for hundreds of years, the buried city of Pompeii has given archaeologists astonishing snapshots of life in ancient Rome, but it still holds some secrets.
Pompeii is famous for its volcanic destruction. But beneath the surface lies a darker truth. One way that technology is really helping us to understand the city as archaeologists. Recently, scientists have uncovered hidden spaces underneath the ash that contain evidence of even greater horror. These new details of Pompeii are revealing far more chilling secrets than anyone imagined. Pompeii's beauty was built on something rotten. Pompeii is usually shown as a beautiful ruin with colorful walls, wide courtyards, and signs of pleasure everywhere. But none of those beautiful images prepare you for what scientists just unearthed, a space that should not have existed. While tourists are guided through homes filled with art and gardens and are told stories about rich Romans enjoying wine, food, and comfort, what is rarely said out loud is that this beauty was built on lives that were crushed, controlled, and erased. The city did not run on freedom or creativity. It ran on fear, force, and humans who had no choice. Beneath every painted wall and polished floor lived enslaved people whose existence was never meant to be remembered. They had no legal names of their own, no control over their bodies, and no power to refuse orders. In Roman law, enslaved people were property, not humans. They could be bought, sold, punished, or killed with little consequence. Such conduct was not secret behavior or hidden abuse. It was open, normal, and accepted as the natural order of life. Pompeii depended on this system completely. Enslaved men and women cooked meals, cleaned waste, carried water, worked the fields, cared for animals, and maintained the homes of the wealthy. Some worked from before sunrise until long after dark, sleeping wherever space allowed. Others were trained into skilled labor. But skill did not bring freedom. It only brought higher expectations and harsher punishment for failure. Every luxury and convenience enjoyed by the free population came directly from this forced labor. Ancient Roman writers were honest about how they saw these people. They described slaves as speaking tools, a phrase that sounds cruel because it was cruel. It meant enslaved people were viewed the same way as carts or plows, except they could understand commands. This belief shaped every part of Roman life. It justified overcrowding, hunger, violence, and total control. It also explains why their living spaces were never designed for comfort or dignity. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, it not only killed Pompeii's citizens, it trapped this entire system inside layers of ash and stone. The disaster froze homes, streets, and bodies in place, but it also froze injustice. Wealthy families were preserved in dining rooms and courtyards, while enslaved people were often sealed into back rooms, work areas, and forgotten corners. For centuries, excavation focused almost entirely on the rich spaces, reinforcing the idea that Pompeii was a city of beauty and pleasure. This focus created a dangerous gap. What people wanted to see rather than what was actually there shaped the story of Pompeii. The enslaved were reduced to shadows in the background, rarely discussed and rarely studied. Their suffering was treated as unimportant, even though they made up a large part of the population. For a long time, the ruins spoke loudly, but only for the powerful. But then, modern scientists realized something was wrong with the story that celebrated the villas, but ignored the people who kept them running. They began asking harder questions about where the enslaved people lived, how they were controlled, and what their daily lives truly looked like. Pompeii, they suspected, was hiding something far darker than beautiful ruins. Digging where no one wanted to look. For a very long time, the story of Pompeii was shaped by choice, not truth. Excavations returned again and again to grand villas, painted walls, and wide dining rooms because those spaces felt safe, impressive, and easy to celebrate. Places connected to human suffering were pushed aside, ignored, or labeled unimportant, as if human pain did not deserve the same attention as beauty. This was not an accident. It was comfort guiding science. And comfort always avoids ugly answers. That pattern finally broke when looters punched illegal tunnels into the ground near the Tuita Julianana villa. These were not careful digs or respectful searches, but violent holes cut through history to steal objects for money. When authorities discovered this damage, they realized something worse than theft was happening. Entire sections of Pompeii that had never been studied were at risk of being destroyed before anyone even knew what they contained. Scientists had no choice but to move fast. The villa sat outside the city walls, far from the places tourists walk and photograph. This meant researchers could begin excavating right away. They began by using ground-penetrating radar, a tool that sends signals into the ground and reads how they bounce back. When the signal changes, it shows empty spaces, walls, or buried rooms. This allowed the scientists to see what was hidden under meters of hardened volcanic ash without breaking anything open. What the scans revealed was shocking. A small enclosed space that did not match the size or layout of elite rooms, but instead looked tight, boxed in, and cut off. Once the scans confirmed a buried room, excavation started with extreme care. No heavy machines were used because the ash was holding fragile details in place. Hand tools, soft brushes, and vacuum systems slowly removed layers of ash grain by grain. Every movement mattered because one wrong action could erase evidence that had survived for nearly 2,000 years. Before a single object was touched, the room was recorded using laser scanning. This technology creates a full 3D digital copy of the space, capturing its shape, size, and every detail down to the smallest crack. This step mattered because it locked the room in time, making sure modern hands could not accidentally change the story. Even if the room collapsed later, the evidence would still exist. As the ash cleared, scientists began to understand what they were standing inside. This was not a storage room, a workshop, or a servant corridor. It was a living space, but one stripped of comfort, privacy, and dignity. The air felt heavy, not because of the dust, but because of what the room represented. This was where enslaved people slept, waited, and existed between commands. The goal of this excavation was never treasure or fame. No gold was expected, and no art was hoped for. The scientists were looking for something far more unsettling. They were searching for proof of lives that Rome treated as disposable, and history chose to forget. When the ash was cleared and the space revealed, the truth was impossible to ignore. Because what lay inside was not wealth or beauty, but a room that exposed how little these lives were valued. The ground had kept that proof hidden. But now the chilling details were being forced into the light. A doorway into a life meant to be forgotten. The Tvita Juliana villa stood north of Pompeii's walls as a clear symbol of power and control. From the outside, it looked like many other wealthy estates with space, order, and distance separating the owners from the noise of the city. What mattered was what sat behind it, hidden from view, placed where visitors were never meant to look. This was not an accident of design. It was a decision made to keep certain lives out of sight. The small room that scientists uncovered was pushed away from the main house and placed near the stables and the garden where animals were kept, and labor never stopped. The location alone told a story because enslaved people were expected to wake early, work until exhaustion, and sleep close to the tools and animals they served. Comfort was not part of the plan, and privacy was not considered. Rest was only allowed so work could continue the next day. The size of the room was shocking once measured. Just 16 square meters held multiple human beings, likely adults and possibly children, forced to share the same air, the same floor, and the same narrow space. There was no separation between sleeping, storing belongings, and daily living. Every movement would have been seen and heard. There was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to hide, and nowhere to be alone. The walls were bare and rough with no paint, no carvings, and no signs of care. In wealthy Roman homes, walls were covered in color and images meant to impress guests. Here, nothing existed to soften the space or make life easier. The emptiness was not random. It showed exactly how little value was placed on the people who lived there. Their presence mattered only as long as they could work. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the state of preservation. This room was not destroyed by fire, collapse, or panic. It was frozen exactly as it had been left. The eruption sealed it in ash, locking every object and surface in place. This meant scientists were not imagining how enslaved people lived. They were seeing it directly without guesswork or later changes. The doorway itself told another shocking story. It was narrow and plain with no sign it was meant to be noticed. Walking through it today feels like crossing a line between the public story of Pompeii and the private reality Rome tried to hide. This was not a dramatic prison cell with chains or bars. It was worse. This was a room designed to make suffering feel routine and invisible. For the first time, archaeologists were not reading about slavery in ancient texts written by elite men. They were standing inside a space built for people who left no written records and whose voices were never meant to survive. The ash did not just preserve walls and floors. It preserved the truth of how these people were meant to live and how little room was given to their humanity. And inside this cramped space, the suffering did not stay abstract because the objects left behind showed exactly how these lives were managed, limited, and controlled. A room designed to strip away humanity. The moment researchers took in the full room, it became clear that this space was not made to support life, but to control it because every object inside pointed to use, obedience, and exhaustion rather than care or safety. 2 crude beds were forced against the walls, leaving almost no open floor. Even these beds showed clear signs of inequality since one held a thin, worn mattress, while the other was nothing but hard wooden planks meant to press into tired bones night after night. There was no effort to soften the space or reduce suffering. And this was not an accident or neglect, but a deliberate choice. Near the bed stood small wooden cabinets, but these were not for personal items, clothing, or memories. Because enslaved people were not expected to own anything meaningful, these cabinets held tools, ropes, and basic work items, which meant the room never stopped being part of the job, even during sleep. Work followed these people into every moment of their lives. Ceramic jugs and rough vessels were scattered across the floor, and their placement showed they were used often and carelessly, not because the people inside were careless, but because survival left no space for order or pride. These containers were used for carrying water, mixing feed, or holding supplies for animals, and their presence inside the sleeping space showed there was no clear line between labor and rest. Everything happened in the same cramped air under the same low ceiling without pause. There were no walls inside the room, no curtains, and no barriers of any kind, which meant there was no privacy at all. Sleeping, dressing, storing tools, and simply existing all happened in the same tight space. And this constant exposure stripped away dignity over time. In such a place, even silence would have felt heavy because there was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to be alone with a thought, and nowhere to escape the presence of others who were just as trapped. Under one of the beds, scientists uncovered a small ceramic container, and inside it were the remains of a rat that had died during the eruption. The animal likely ran for cover when the ground shook and the sky darkened. It crawled into the same space where the enslaved people lived, only to suffocate and die when the ash sealed the room shut. This detail was disturbing because it showed that even pests shared the same air, the same fear, and the same end of the enslaved people. This room was not destroyed by fire or chaos, but frozen in place by ash, which preserved every harsh detail exactly as it was on the final day. Nothing was moved, cleaned, or softened by time. What remained was proof that this space was not shelter, not housing, and not a mistake of poor planning, but a controlled environment designed to hold human bodies at the lowest possible level of care. But the deepest damage done in this room could not be measured with tools because it lived inside the mind. Control without chains. When researchers examined the room more closely, one detail stood out in a deeply unsettling way because there were no chains, no cuffs, no iron rings in the walls, and no signs of physical restraints anywhere in the space. At first glance, this absence might look like restraint or mercy. But the truth was far worse because it showed that chains were not needed at all. The people who lived here were already trapped by something stronger than metal, and that was complete control over their survival. Enslaved people in Roman villas were not held in place by locks or bars, but by fear that never stopped working, even while they slept. They depended on the villa owner for food, shelter, and protection from punishment, which meant every act of obedience was tied directly to staying alive. Leaving the property without permission was not an escape, but a death sentence. A runaway slave could be beaten, branded, tortured, or killed. And this was known by everyone. The system worked because the threat was always present even when no guard was watching. This is why the room had no door that locked from the outside and no signs of forced confinement. The people inside did not need to be physically held because they had been trained over the years to obey without question. Control was enforced through routine punishment, public violence, and constant reminders that their bodies did not belong to them. When fear becomes part of daily life, it replaces chains completely. The layout of the room added another disturbing layer to this control because the placement of the bed suggests that more than one person lived there at the same time, possibly a small family. This means parents may have slept beside their children, knowing that none of them owned their future, their labor, or even their bodies. Family bonds were not protected out of care, but allowed only when they made enslaved people easier to manage and more productive. A parent who feared punishment would work harder, obey faster, and endure more pain to protect their child. Children raised in this space would have grown up learning submission as a rule of life, not because it was taught with words, but because it was enforced through daily reality. They would have watched adults obey orders instantly, accept abuse, quietly, and suppress anger to survive. Over time, this constant pressure shaped how people thought, moved, and spoke until resistance felt impossible and obedience felt normal. This kind of control was quiet and constant, which made it even more powerful. The knowledge of what would happen if rules were broken was enough to keep people in place. Then, as scientists continued to examine the space, they noticed something that did not fit this picture at all. The food that exposed a brutal irony. When scientists examined the food stored near the room, they expected to find scraps or signs of neglect. But what they uncovered told a far stranger story. The jars and bowls showed that the people who slept in this space were not starving at all. Amphora jars, which were large clay containers used to store food and liquids, held beans that were still identifiable, while nearby bowls were shaped and sized for holding fruit. This was not emergency food or waste left behind. It was planned, measured, and consistent. The beans found here were filling and rich in protein, which means they helped build and maintain muscle, while fruit provided sugar, water, and basic nutrients that kept the body working. This kind of diet was not common for free poor citizens in Pompeii, many of whom survived mainly on wheat porridge or rough bread, eaten day after day with little variety. Meat, fresh fruit, and legumes like beans were rare for ordinary workers who lived outside elite villas and relied on unstable wages. This is where the irony becomes brutal. Because these enslaved people were fed better than many free citizens. Yet they lived without freedom, dignity, or control over their own lives. The food was not given out of care or concern, but out of calculation. A well-fed body could work longer hours, lift heavier loads, and recover faster from exhaustion. In this system, food was not nourishment for a human being, but fuel for a tool. Roman slavery operated on cold logic where keeping enslaved people alive and strong was cheaper than replacing them. Feeding them properly reduced sickness, lowered the risk of collapse during labor, and protected the owner's investment. Their health mattered only because it affected productivity. Once a body could no longer work, it lost its value, regardless of how well it had been fed before. This creates a deeply unsettling contrast when placed beside the lives of free poor citizens who technically owned their bodies but struggled daily to feed themselves. A free man might walk the streets hungry, searching for work that paid too little to buy proper food, while an enslaved worker inside a villa ate better meals, but had no say over where they lived, how they worked, or whether they could leave. Freedom without resources meant hunger, while captivity with resources meant survival without dignity. The food in this room exposed how Roman society measured human worth in a twisted way, where freedom did not guarantee care, and enslavement did not always mean starvation. The system allowed enslaved people to live better physically than free workers, but only because their bodies were owned, managed, and controlled. They were kept alive not because their lives mattered, but because their labor did. Even the act of eating would have been shaped by this control because meals were likely timed, monitored, and limited to what was needed to maintain strength. There was no choice, no comfort, and no pleasure attached to food. It served a single purpose, which was to keep the body useful for the next day of work. For scientists standing in this space, the presence of good food next to such a harsh living area forced a painful realization. Slavery in Pompeii was not always about neglect or visible cruelty, but about efficient exploitation, where people were treated well enough to work and poorly enough to never forget their place. This contrast stripped away any illusion of kindness and revealed a system built on control, calculation, and cruelty, which is what made the discovery so disturbing. It forced scientists to face a disturbing truth about Roman society: life preserved in ash, not dignity. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, everything stopped without warning. And the people inside this space had no time to prepare, no chance to escape, and no control over what came next. Work ended in an instant, which is why tools remained where hands had dropped them, beds stayed pushed against the walls, and everyday objects sat exactly as they were used, hours before death arrived. No one returned to recover belongings or to erase the signs of how this place was used, because the city itself was wiped out and buried under layers of burning ash and debris. What makes this discovery so disturbing is that there is no sign that anything went wrong in the room before the eruption, because the structure shows no damage, no collapse, and no emergency repairs. Life here was already harsh, controlled, and stripped down to the bare minimum long before the volcano exploded. The eruption did not destroy a peaceful life. It froze a system that was already built on suffering and control. Ash poured into the space and sealed it shut, filling the air, covering the floor, and locking every chilling detail in place. Over time, the ash hardened, creating a perfect mold of how enslaved people were forced to live. This kind of preservation is extremely rare because most ancient sites are damaged by rebuilding, looting, or later use. Here, none of that happened. The room became a silent record that could not be altered or softened by later generations. For archaeologists, this clarity was deeply unsettling because they were not forced to guess how slavery worked in Pompeii. They could see it directly. The layout of the room, the lack of space, the shared beds, and the work tools all pointed to a life of constant labor with no privacy and no rest. Slavery was not an idea here. It was a daily process built into walls, floors, and furniture. This discovery also shattered the popular image of Pompeii as a city frozen in beauty and culture, because the same ash that preserved colorful murals and grand houses also preserved cruelty. The city's beauty came at a cost, and that cost was paid by people whose lives were never meant to be remembered. Statues and paintings celebrate wealth and power, but this room exposes the human price behind them. Science played a critical role in revealing this truth, because scans, measurements, and physical remains cannot be argued away or romanticized. Ground scans showed how the space was arranged, while preserved objects showed how it was used. These facts replaced long-held myths with evidence that speaks clearly and without emotion. In the end, the Pompeii site did not just preserve a moment in time. It preserved a judgment. The ash did not protect dignity or justice, but protected proof. And that proof forces the modern world to confront a city that was not only vibrant and advanced, but deeply cruel at its core. What do you think about this discovery? Thank you for watching.